Since 1950, we've lost over half the world's coral reef. About 500 million people are directly reliant on one of the ecosystem services that these provide. So alongside like the race for AGI that's going on, I was with the Google DeepMind teams, AlphaFold, or some of the weather predicting systems they've had recently, the foundational model for Coral Reef acoustics. Loads of cool tricks we found to try and make that possible. Get it with underwater drones that are autonomous, that are going out there and collecting this data for us all the time. And so we could have this almost perfect digital twin of the world's reefs. They're 0.1% of the ocean floor. Perhaps it's not inconceivable in a few decades' time we could have mapped all of the world's coral reefs using this.
Over a year ago, I left Google X to create a startup applying AI for ocean health, with a dream of creating a big brain which could model entire ecosystems like coral reefs and empower humans to make better decisions on how to protect life. On my journey, I meet incredible people who are smart, kind, and cool. Ben Williams is one of them. Ben is a brilliant PhD researcher at the University College London, specializing in using AI for coral reefs health. He works at the largest coral reef restoration project in the world, operated by Mars. Together with Google DeepMind, he developed SurfPerch, an innovative bioacoustics model designed to monitor the health of coral reefs by listening to their audio. Ben's research includes field work in Indonesia and creating systems to detect and stop destructive blast fishing. Join us to learn how AI is transforming coral reef restoration with Ben Williams. Landscape of fear. You were just talking about the landscape of fear. What is that?
Yeah, I should have guessed you'd bring this up first. So this was a concept one of my supervisors, David Koenig, who's at Zoological Society of London, is really interested in. And it's the concept where predators have an influence on the broader ecological system. So the classic example a lot of people have heard of is when wolves got reintroduced into Yellowstone. You had all these deer who were just grazing any new growth of the forest out there. But the moment the wolves got introduced, well, over time, I guess not immediately, but that completely changed their grazing patterns. It meant trees could regrow in areas where they weren't previously. And that actually changed the ecosystem in an enormous way. So rivers changed the paths they move. They had so many trophic cascades, is a term we'd use. And we expect there's probably similar things observed on coral reef habitats where I often work as well. Not too much work has been done in that area, at least not with acoustics where I've mainly been focused, but it'd be really interesting to see if there is something going on there.
Wow. Ecologists love this kind of landscape or soundscape or fear. Is it called like fearscape or is it different? Just like
landscape of fear is a term I've heard. Fearscape is great, probably even easier, but yeah.
That's so interesting. When you told me landscape of fear, I was like, what is that? Learning so much. Ben, what mission are you on? And why does this mission matter to you and everybody else listening right now?
Yeah, so my broad personal mission, I guess, begins with my perspective on the planet we live on. And I think there's a great analogy, as you may have heard this story before, where if you imagine we're, say, 100 people or 1,000 people, and we all live on some spaceship drifting around in the solar system, and all we have access to is all the things on the spaceship at that time, and then the energy from the sun that gets to us, and that's it. If you just imagine how sustainable and efficiently you'd have to use all the resources, recycling all of it, if you want to carry on for generations and generations, it's actually no different on the planet we live on at the moment, right? So it's just that there's 8 billion of us and it's on a planetary scale rather than just a tiny spaceship. But all we get is the energy from the sun and then the resources we have on planet. I know there's talks of asteroid mining and things like that, but I think in terms of thinking that perspective is really key. And so my mission more broadly is contributing to a way that allows us to live like that, where, you know, we could live indefinitely in our planet with the resources that we have. And so I've been pursuing work that helps me contribute to that, working in sustainability, working in conservation.
Do we need multiple spaceships or how do you think?
Yeah, I think it's something people talk about often, isn't it? And I believe it's really exciting to think about the frontiers we could push humanity and, you know, whether that's just one more planet or going fully interstellar, which is super exciting. And we, as a species, we've really got like an explorative sort of mindset, haven't we? And we're always thinking about going new places we never have before, which I think is really important. But we should definitely maintain the mindset that we just have this one spaceship and anything else is a bonus. Nothing can ever replace the planet that we've come from and that we've started on. And that's the most important priority, I think, before we'd look to expand elsewhere.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do I need to know about Ben in terms of like influences or early people who affected you? Like what make you you?
Yeah, so it's hard to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, but I suppose one was early on for me. I guess I'm one of the earliest generations who grew up right from the start of my schooling days being taught about climate change and how it was this huge kind of existential threat. We've had environmental challenges for decades or centuries, but growing up with that mindset and feeling like that was something looming over the horizon definitely shaped me. And I think you see it increasingly so with younger generations now, don't you? And so that was always in the back of my mind, but I was super interested in science and technology. My parents kind of had some influences there. None of them worked in that area, but were always kind of pushing me towards that direction when I showed an interest. I had some brilliant teachers who were important on that as well. So those were back in my younger years. And growing up, watching things like David Attenborough, everyone says, well, those BBC nature documentaries, I think just gave me such an appreciation for our planet even further, and some of the amazing things out there. So that all kind of was, I think, going on in the back of my mind without me really directly noticing or acting on it. And at school, perhaps we didn't have the best careers advice. I think like many, I first thought, well, you know, I like sciences, perhaps I go the medical route, I become a doctor or something like that. But it was only in the last couple of years of my high school days where I realized it was actually environmental and ecology challenges that I knew I wanted to work on, and that I could go and do that, and that there were opportunities there, which is something I didn't really know about. So I guess that kind of comes up to the end of my formative years. And then when I started my university education, that just continued, and I was able to build from there.
Uh-huh. Was there any specific event like in the last couple of years which happened so that you're like, okay, I need to work on the environmental stuff, or there was just gradual?
No, I think it certainly was gradual. It was more realizing the opportunities that were out there. It was almost a careers kind of thing, if anything. You'd see all these amazing explorers in National Geographic or reading about amazing science, but I had no idea what the route was to get there. But it was as I grew older and I had the opportunity to start just learning a little bit about how that worked and starting to think, actually, no, maybe I could be one of those people. Because before it just seemed like something, like it wasn't a real job, or it was unobtainable, and I didn't even know what opportunity was out there. So I guess it was that over time shift in understanding that put me in that direction.
Can you identify one research expedition which changed your perception of kind of reality?
Probably the most important research expedition in shaping me, there could be many, but a really key one was the first time I was really fortunate to visit Spamonde in Indonesia, which is where Mars, who I've been collaborating with for many years now, have been supporting the world's largest reef restoration program for a long time now. And I was really fortunate to join as a research intern right at the end of my undergraduate, as there was an expedition going from our university of researchers who work in acoustic monitoring, who'd been speaking with Mars and had been given the opportunity to go and do some cool science there, basically. And why it was so key in shaping me was because I'd studied coral reefs a lot. I knew loads about them. I've been fortunate to visit a few in my studies up to that point. But seeing the stark contrast between thriving, healthy reefs in this area and reefs that had been destroyed primarily all through bomb fishing, that turned into complete rubble fields. It looked like the moon next to these habitats that are as stunning as reefs get, pretty much. And then seeing that actually those reefs can be restored in just a few short years on quite a large scale, I think was really formative in so many ways. Seeing the difficulty it takes to do that, but also seeing it's possible, and the scientific mindset. That was really the start of my graduate research career. So that's where I was, for the first time, thinking about questions properly about, here's some science that we're going to try and do, and how is that going to get done, rather than just learning from your professors who've done it themselves, or reading about it. You have to go and do it yourself properly, and it's going out there in the public. It's not just contributing to some course you might be doing.
Mars, you mean the chocolate bar company?
Yes, that's it.
What incentivized them to do this kind of work?
They've been working in the area for close to 2 decades now.
Wow.
I believe so. How the story starts is Mars work a lot in Indonesia. There's a lot of the cocoa for their products come out there, and I believe other products for various brands. So they own a whole host of brands you're probably familiar with. Lots of pet food is the biggest part of their business, and confectionery products, things like that. And I know they were interested in supporting environmental initiatives in the area as well. So I believe how the project started, Mars's involvement was a guy called Noel Janetsky, who he's Australian, worked for Mars, and I believe was talking to some scientists working in the area, trying out some of their first ideas of this restoration approach. And then they realized this is something that could really benefit from that business mindset of working at scale and having a kind of supply chain mentality. So going right from the very beginnings of all the materials to restore the reefs, right up the way to the end of being able to, dust your hands off and leave the reef to then thrive on its own. So that's how it became involved for them. There's Frank Mars, who's on the board, who was really fascinated by this project. And so in 2019, they kind of went more public on this. And Sheba, one of their brands, is now the backer for it. And so over the last couple of decades, I think there's about $20 million has gone into restoring coral reefs in Indonesia from Mars Global, which is awesome to see. And it's amazing to see an industry giant really lead and innovate in some kind of environmental restoration. I'm not sure if there's any other parallels. It's really impressive to see.
Interesting. Do you think we could somehow incentivize other industry leaders to do something like Mars does?
Potentially, yeah. And I think there may be ways to do that. I think especially as the concept of biodiversity and carbon credits grow. I know people have good and bad opinions on those, but I think they are going to grow and become more commonplace. And so that certainly might be a route. And I think fundamentally from people I've met who work at some of these places, far more so, I don't have a frame of reference really to 20 years ago or further back from that, but I really get the impression a lot of people do care. And they're people like me, in a few years, there might be our generation are leading these businesses, and most of them do really care about the environment and they do want to leave the world a better place. And so I hope that will help. But I think that's going to come with the people who want to do that, but also the regulation that's needed. So they have to deliver on these credit schemes or whatever else it may be. I think that's going to be key, because otherwise if a competitor's not doing it and you're sinking loads of resources into this, then it's perhaps might not give you the competitive edge, at least not in every setting. There's perhaps two sides of it are needed there.
Yeah. And what the heck is bomb fishing? You mentioned people do this? What the hell?
Yeah, it's shocking to think how much it goes on in the world still, and it pretty much is what it says on the tin, right? So these fishermen go out with basically homemade bottle bombs. I believe it's kind of fertilizer and a detonator, usually in a beer bottle or something like that. They throw these onto the reefs, normally after a spotter's been in the water to see if there are fish nearby that they want to catch. They get back in the water, the bomb goes onto the reef, and it will stun or kill any fish within a large radius. So super easy way just to kill all those fish instantly and go and pick them up. But of course it decimates the habitat. So bomb fishers go out, and normally if there's a successful spot where they've been before, they go back again and again and again. And it's like some kind of blitz going on these reefs, and it turns it into rubble. And these rubble fields generally never recover. In the ecological literature, they're called killing fields, because the juvenile corals, those little polyps, they might settle on a piece of rubble. And then because that rubble's now unstable, it turns in the waves and the tides, and that coral is smothered, it dies, it gets blown away. So there's no longer this stable base for a reef to build on. And so they stay ecologically trapped for decades, probably longer. So that's a big issue. And that's the approach that Mars developed, was able to overcome this ecological entrapment.
Wow, that's terrible. This is happening. Is it happening only in Indonesia or like everywhere in the world?
No, around vast areas of the tropics. I actually have Amy DeLuart as a volunteer working with me, who's doing a fantastic piece of research into where is bomb fishing happening in the world. So she's picked it up on South America, which I wasn't aware where it's happening. So in Ecuador, we know it happens in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Hong Kong, a lot of the east coast of Africa. It's a really big issue in a lot of the tropics. And I think it's a big issue in the places where often us from the global north or the west might be fortunate to visit. It happens in the places where we're less likely to go. And so people have not heard of this issue. So it's rampant, and I think it's an enormous driver to destruction on reefs. So perhaps we can move on to a project I'm working on later that's in the early days of hoping to try and develop a technology to tackle this. But yeah, it's a huge issue.
That's crazy. It's happening. And I was always thinking that industrial fishing like causes a lot of disruption, like obviously like bottom trawlers and so on. But I never thought that like local communities could also be like doing this kind of stuff.
Often it comes top down from basically organized crime groups who they're the ones who they have access to some of the rare parts that are needed to make the bombs, and then they're just selling to the people on the ground. And again, you know, if you've got loads of people in the community doing it and they're collecting all these fish, then you're massively incentivized to do it.
And what incentivized usually those people? Is it like because like poverty and they need to make some money or like get food for themselves? Like how do we solve this, or like how do we break this vicious cycle?
Yeah, it's tricky to know because, of course, everything is on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, it seems like from what we've read in the literature, where people have gone and spoken to those in these communities doing this, is often it's actually not the absolute poorest members at the bottom of the, the poverty line there. It's those who are maybe slightly further above because there's a cost barrier to getting access to those bombs. But in the grand scheme of things, these are people who are not living on large incomes by any stretch. So it certainly is being able just to get security for themselves and their families. And so I think that's really important to stay sensitive to. So you could go out with enforcement, tackling bomb fishers or those organized crime groups that might be responsible for it. But you also need the alternative livelihoods as well, so that people have something that could fill that income gap.
Wow. And what did you learn in this expedition about the kind of coral reefs? Like, first of all, how does the like healthy coral reef is different from the not healthy coral reef?
It really depends on the cause of the destruction. So something that's like bomb fishing, and this could go on over the course of a few weeks in an area, and it goes from looking like the most beautiful pictures of coral reefs you've seen to literally a bomb site, right? And it's just rubble. All the colours gone. There's not even any trace of there used to be live coral there. We can get similar things with storm events. So it's really sad to see one of the reefs in the area where we worked. I've been over it many times. It was actually had 3 of our healthy control sites were on this island. So these were part of our experimental setup. Got flattened by a storm, which was really sad to see. It's part of the natural cycles. Of course, storms are increasing in their intensity and frequency. But then also we were there a few months after the storm and there were already signs of recovery. So it hadn't decimated it to the point where this rubble was no longer stable. So we were seeing corals that had been upturned were starting to grow back the other way. There were new colonies that had settled. So there's that kind of level of recovery can happen as well. But then in many other places, the stresses we have they're kind of persistent environmental, usually pollution. So whenever development happens on the coast nearby, reefs start to die. And I've been in many places in the world where there's plenty of corals that cling on. And of course, the further away you get from that, the better they're doing. But you can really clearly see, well, this reef is just a few kilometers away from this city and there's nothing here. But if we're out, a few dozen kilometers, they look absolutely pristine. So there's everything in between that you see there in terms of those health aspects.
Yeah, wow. How did the day-to-day job look like? Do you just go out and dive, or like scuba dive or free dive with the reef and like collect some? What information do you kind of collect?
Yeah. So on this expedition and most I've been on, especially out in Indonesia, we set up, now Mars have a really nice office, or it's kind of like it's a house office, all of that. So a lot of their teams stay in it when they're working there. We start from there every day. We leave the city, we go out to the jetty where all the boats set off, and then it's a 30-minute boat journey to the reefs. And then we're out on the reef all day. So it's around a place called Bontasua Island. I believe it's about, I couldn't say exactly, but let's say it's about 40 kilometers off from the city. And then during the day, we've become pretty efficient now. So we've normally got a whole load of different scientific projects going on. We're poking and prodding the reef in loads of different ways. So for me, that's been acoustics, but we've got people getting image data. We've got people out counting fish or studying their behavior in the water. And we normally have our healthy and degraded control sites, and then the restored sites that we've been studying to see how closely do these restored sites resemble the naturally healthy ecosystems that are there. So myself, I might be putting hydrophones down on each of these reefs, then helping support other projects perhaps for a few days, and I might go out to move the hydrophone, swap the batteries, something like that. We're normally snorkeling and free diving everything we can because we move so much further. And if you're following safe diving practices, you should only be doing 3 ascents in a day, but we could hit all 18 of our sites in a day. We've done that in the past for quick projects. So you can be in the water just for minutes at a time, or sometimes for up to 2 hours. We can be underwater if we are diving on these really shallow sites. So it's always a lot of fun. It's super knackering. I think after about 2 weeks is generally the time we stay out there now. And yeah, we're all really tired by then. I've done 3 months in places in the past, which is a lot of fun. But you're always ready to finish by the end of one of those longer expeditions.
Wow, sounds like a dream job to me. And what are you doing right now for work?
Yeah, the field work is amazing, and I love the balance that gives with the rest of my work. So my day-to-day at the moment, probably for the majority of my year, is I'll be working on my research rights. So I'm doing my PhD. That could be I'm doing analysis. I work in using machine learning models for Coral Reef acoustics. So developing models, training these. Probably a lot of it is actually just getting the pipelines ready for that, sorting the data, and then looking at our results, trying things again, writing these up. And of course, things like teaching and conferences and all that stuff that is part of a course on a PhD as well.
Wow, this is amazing. And the corals, do they make sounds, or like why do people do coral reef acoustics?
Yeah, so the analogy I always like to give is if you imagine the rainforest, this is something people are familiar with. Everyone's heard recordings of rainforests where you've got the birds, the insects, the mammals, all those organisms producing all this noise when it's a really healthy, thriving rainforest habitat. If it's somewhere that's been logged or converted to a palm oil forest, there's still a bit of definitely a biological soundscape, but it's very different. And the diversity and the complexity of it is greatly reduced. And it's exactly the same on the coral reef. So people are normally surprised to hear that. And there are some amazing sounds that fish make on reefs and other habitats. And so these are so poorly studied. We don't know often who's even making that sound on the reef, what fish it is. But we know we see a much higher diversity and complexity in the soundscape on healthy reefs compared to those that have been degraded. And so that's kind of a concept of the soundscape. And we're trying to show whether we can learn about the state of the reefs by listening. And we also know it's not just us who like to do that, but it's the juvenile fish, corals, other invertebrates that in their first few days of life, they drift out into the open ocean and they develop in their what's called their pelagic larval phase. They grow up for a week or 2 weeks, and then they need to return to these reef habitats. And they are actually attracted back to the reefs, firstly by listening out to them. So the sound of a healthy reef has been found to attract far more of these. And there's recent research from my former lab, who were at the University of Exeter, now at the University of Bristol, led by Steve Simpson, who've shown it looks like it might be the fish noises on these habitats that is attracting these back and getting them to settle on the reef. So it's a vital ecosystem function, is the term we'd use as well.
Oh, this is so cool. I've heard someone install the speakers underwater and play the sounds of the coral, like healthy coral reef, and then it was attracting lots of fish. Or making actual reef healthy. Is that true? Or
yeah, so that was work that was pioneered by that lab. So at the University of Exeter at the time by Steve Simpson and my very close colleague Timothy Lamont, who's now at the University of Lancaster. They published one of the first and biggest studies to show this on a place called Lizard Island on the Great Barrier Reef, where we've done field work. So it was a proof of concept at the time, but now that project, the Reef Song project, is scaling, and they're trying that on a large amount of reefs around Lizard Island. And I know others are interested in seeing, could this be used to boost restoration? So it's always tricky to do these things on, if you think at something that is as large as the Great Barrier Reef, we can't throw your speakers down on the whole thing. But perhaps there's smaller use cases and ways to develop ways to scale it that we can use as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And in terms of audio, do you record it kind of like stereo, like from different directions, maybe a few cameras, or usually it's like one, or you can maybe record the audio simultaneously from multiple microphones? How does it work?
Yeah, so when we're collecting it for our work, mostly we used to have these hydrophones called sound traps. They recorded omnidirectional, so from all directions. We've now moved to recorders called hydromophs. They're about 20 times cheaper than sound traps. We helped to develop the hydromophs a few years ago with Open Acoustics, which is a group out of Oxford. And because they're so much cheaper, it means we can scattergun these across the reef. So we will collect them from multiple sites on the same reef and from others that are disconnected. These actually record monodirectionally, so mostly in front of them. But for the most part, that doesn't matter so much for us. If we're recording on a reef that's a square kilometer in size, we just kind of place it in the middle. And these things are hearing sounds. It's hard to know, but the loudest fish sounds we're hearing are probably never more than 10 meters away from these microphones anyway. So yeah, but there's loads more work to be done in what's that kind of spatial heterogeneity of the soundscape at smaller scales as well.
Does the healthy reef sounds like usually different from the restored reef, or like are they quite similar? Usually if you restore it could sound like a healthy reef, or restored usually like kind of more flat?
This is really early days, this research, so we've only worked on one data set, and here we found that we started with a manual listening approach. This was led by my colleague Tim once again, who showed that we heard a high diversity of fish sounds on healthy reefs and on degraded reefs, and that this diversity had fully returned on restored reefs. So I think there were 10 or so fish sounds he was looking for, and these were pretty much all back on the restored reefs. My work was showing that we could, rather than focusing on the individual sounds, we could feed in the entire recording. So we'd give it 1 minute at a time into a machine learning algorithm. And it found that the restored reefs, once we trained the algorithm on healthy and degraded reefs, almost always those recordings it would classify as sounding healthy on the restored reefs. So we know there's lots of aspects of a soundscape, and they appear to be coming back on those restored reefs in the timeframes we're looking at. So these were reefs that were 3 years of age and older. I'm really interested to answer that question in other places around the world. And we've got data now from Indonesia once again, Australia, the Maldives, Mexico, and Kenya. And I'm hoping to see, is this something that we observe in all those places? Is it probably a global phenomenon, or is it something that might depend on a kind of local basis?
Wow. Would be so curious to hear how reefs are differently, singing in different places, because I've heard whales could make different songs in different locations and maybe speak even different languages.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure there's all these different organisms that are making different sounds, and we'll hear a whole load in Indonesia that we won't hear in the Caribbean and vice versa.
And how does the restoration work in general? What people usually do? So I've seen people install some sort of artificial frame, and I've heard there is like microfragmentation or like larval propagation, but I don't know much about the area.
Yeah, so the approach that Mars have been using is focused on these metal frames. So they call them reef stars, and they're a hexagonal reef frame basically that's been covered in resin, then covered in reef sand, and then what they do is they put 15 coral fragments in, or micro fragments. I think normally say the length between your finger and thumb. You want fragments about that size because these are the ones most likely to survive. 15 of those get strapped to each of these reef stars, and then they place these down on these rubble fields. They call it a build. And they're actually placed in quite a particular way. So all the legs interleave, they lock in. They then secure these down with cable ties and then stakes around the edges. And the team is phenomenal at this. So they can go out in a week's work. They work with a local community there who are doing a lot of the coral tying, and now actually a lot of them are under the water, scuba diving, doing the build. And in a week, they'll cover about a square kilometre of reef with several hundred reef stars. So it's amazing to see. And then the last step is a bit of maintenance. So normally over the course of 3 months, they'll go over about 4 or 5 times to scrub off any of the algae that grows back, because this comes really quickly, until the fish community is kind of there and able to graze down the algae enough. And from there, you can then leave it. And in 3 years, a lot of the time, you can hardly even see the metal structure was there to begin with. There's loads of other approaches, but it's the one that seems to be scaling to the biggest degree that I've seen in the world, at least. And I think others are increasingly recognizing that.
Wow. And how much does it usually cost to restore one coral reef? Or like, I don't know, I guess it depends on the area. And
Yeah, it's a really important question. And it depends on the size you're going with and the technique you're using. It's not cheap. That's a real barrier. So, as I mentioned earlier, Mars put $20 million into this. And I forget the total footprint they have. I think it's up to about 20 soccer pitches now. It's certainly around that, which is big on a local scale. A drop in the ocean, right? If you're going bigger. They're, I think, about halfway through the restoration they plan to deliver on. So that will continue to grow. But it can depend where you are. So they work in multiple countries. In Australia, everything's really expensive. And so it costs, I think, about 10 times more to do the same area as it would in somewhere like the east coast of Africa or Indonesia, where resources and teams to work on it, where the costs aren't as high.
Wow. And why do we care in general about like coral reefs?
Well, coral reefs are super important because they host over 25% of marine biodiversity is within coral reefs, even though they only cover about 0.1% of the ocean floor. So they're almost this tiny area in terms of ocean habitat, but super important in terms of biodiversity. And there's about 500 million people are directly reliant on one of the ecosystem services that these provide. So this could be as food in terms of fisheries, this could be coastal protection, it could be income from tourism. And you mentioned the aesthetic value, like it's something that I think is hard to measure, but the kind of cultural importance to so many people is key. Like if you've seen the film Moana, you realize to Polynesian people how intertwined they are with reef communities, and that's vital to their identity. So they're super important habitats in the ocean.
How much what's the rate of us losing coral reefs? So like, do we have, did we lose a lot or?
There was a study just a few years ago that did one of the biggest analyses of this. I believe they showed it was since 1950, we've lost over half the world's coral reef. And actually most of that has been due to local pressures. So pollution, running off onto these habitats, destructive fishing, overfishing, because of course if you just remove all the fish anyway, it's a very interconnected system, and then the reef will die as well. So there's loads of causes of destruction. The number one now, of course, is climate change, and that's going to be increasingly the case. So if we stick to 2 degrees of warming by end of century targets, which is a relatively conservative target, we're still set to lose well over 90% of the world's coral reefs. So they're actually really, really threatened, and it's far more likely it will be higher if we don't stick to that. It can be a sad field to be working in as well.
Yeah, is it possible to, I don't know, maybe mutate them or somehow protect them from raising temperatures?
This is something I'm really fascinated in, that I think a lot of people haven't put thought into, or maybe don't like the idea of it. But there's loads of technologies now that can do things right. So you may have heard of a gene drive. It's a technology where you can basically spread like wildfire a gene within a population just through its own natural reproductive cycle. So this was developed at Imperial College London, or at least I'm thinking of one that was for eliminating malaria in sub-Saharan Africa by removing the mosquito populations. So the details are something like, if you put this into a number of male mosquitoes, they breed with females, it's a dominant gene, and then any individuals that don't carry this gene are terminated in the embryo, in the mosquitoes. And so it spreads super rapidly. Now, it might not be that we want to terminate those individuals that might not have bleaching resilience, but maybe it could be something that is one of those, it sounds like science fiction, but one of those technologies to think about in decades' time when all those reefs are dying. I'd certainly be interested in potentially seeing that applied, because if we're going to lose these habitats anyway, well, why not try and give that a go? But I know there's loads of cautions we have to take as well. You know, people firstly don't like the idea of playing God, but actually I think we've already been doing that in terms of the amount of the environment we've been destroying. But of course we need to be really careful and cautious about how this could impact the broader evolution of these species or the ecology of these systems. But that's something that I think could be perhaps a tool in the future.
Yeah, I think there is an unspoken rule in conservation communities usually that instead of maybe if it was a desert, let's keep it kind of a desert, or not make a jungle out of this. But at the same time, I think we're doing kind of geoengineering at scale already for a while. Maybe if we could shift the direction of this kind of instead of doing destructive geoengineering, let's say with agriculture or other things, maybe we could do something better. But
yeah, I totally agree. We've got to be aware of what we've done already, right? And so we might need extreme measures to undo some of that.
I've heard you are about to publish or published a paper recently. What is it about?
So we had our preprint came out just last week from when we're having this conversation. So this was from some work whilst I was with the Google DeepMind team. So I was really fortunate to join as a PhD student researcher for a few months in San Francisco last year. So I joined the Perch team, who are actually DeepMind's in-house bioacoustic team. So they've got people working on loads of awesome scientific projects. You might have heard of AlphaFold or some of the weather predicting systems they've had recently, alongside the race for AGI that's going on. And so there's probably the equivalent of I think it's a handful of people working near full time on bioacoustics. And so they've done loads of pioneering work for this in the bird space at the moment, and a lot of that works out. There's loads of really cool stuff to come out in the next few months as well. And they'd read about some of the work I was doing in the Coral Reef space, which kind of led onto this project. So basically what we wanted to do was develop somewhat of a foundational model for coral reef acoustics, and hopefully for other habitats that have the same kind of sound. So all these fish sounds in the ocean, and perhaps in freshwater systems as well. And so we've got SurfPerch, our new model. And the challenges this is overcoming is, at the moment, bioacousticians would have to spend loads of time annotating data to train a machine learning model. Even though this thing might reduce the annotation work they have further down the line, you normally still have to give them at least several hundred examples of each individual sound you might want to identify. You then normally need loads of computing power, so expensive GPUs that people don't actually have access to, and loads of expertise to run these. It's no easy task. But we wanted to make SurfPerch to try and reduce or eliminate all these issues. And so what it means is now individuals can annotate just a handful of any given examples of a sound that they have in their data set and fine-tune SurfPerch, so no expensive GPU needed. They can do it on a personal laptop, and then start finding all these sounds in their data set. So the work I often think back to is that which I described to my colleague Tim, who was listening to all these fish sounds. It would take about a day to analyze an hour of audio manually, but now we could spend that day doing a whole bunch of different sounds, and then you could inference on a year or more of audio really, really quickly. So that's what our paper is aiming to achieve, and there was loads of cool tricks we found to try and make that possible.
Wow. And what is a foundation model for listeners, for example, who don't know?
Yeah, so there's different definitions, and I think at its core, a foundation model is something like GPT-4 or one of those language models that is used as a basis for other things to build off, and is being trained on a really broad, diverse data set, at least within the domain it's interested in. So it might be the bioacoustic domain for us. And so a foundation model provides exactly that, a foundation to build off that then users can start interacting with either straight off the shelf or just with minimal changes.
And how much data does it take to train such model or compute as well?
So we tried a few different things. We started by actually assembling the largest data set of annotated coral reef recordings, which we needed to train our model, but also to validate how well it was doing. So this was from 16 different data sets from 12 different countries, about 57,000 2-second recordings, which is not bad, but it's still modest in terms of machine learning data sets.
Is it tens of thousands of hours of...
This is only about 30 hours of audio in total. And what we found is this was not enough to train a foundation model. There are already some existing foundational models in acoustics that were trained on data from YouTube that did better than our model trained on coral reef sounds in terms of transferring to new problems in the coral reef audio domain. But what interestingly found was there was a whole load of models trained on bird data, notably perch, trained by the perch team, which was trained on around 2.8 million recordings of birdsong from 10,000 different species. This did better than the model from YouTube. It did better than our model trained only on the reef audio. But the real kind of secret sauce was that we found if we actually mixed all these three domains together in our pre-training, so we were training to recognize 10,000 bird species, are about 40 different classes of sounds we have from coral reefs, and about 200 classes of sound from data similar to that which had been used to develop the YouTube models. We trained on all of those, and then when we gave it new coral reef data it had never seen and fine-tuned it on this, that's the model that gave us the best performance.
This is so interesting. A friend of mine was recently telling me a story that for example, you have like large language model, maybe like Mistral or like Llama, and it's usually really bad at poetry. So it can produce text like poems, but they're not really like fantastic. However, if you, I guess, fine tune it on the like audio data or like make it generate like music, then the same model could produce much better poems. And I was like, whoa, it seems if you train on something like completely different domains and like merge them somehow together into one model, it seems it could be like way more beneficial.
Yeah.
Like in the past we had, I think, like separate models for each domain, and it worked, but now it seems the time of combining uncombinable. And this example is like really resonates a lot with me.
Yeah, totally. I think it's cool to think about how it will transfer to, just acoustics more broadly. You could use those strategies to, solve loads of bioacoustic problems, but also just other things in the field of acoustic machine learning as well. So yeah, it was a really cool finding. And I think people will probably increasingly find that kind of domain mixing can help really improve performance on these areas where we don't have loads of data to begin with.
And how does it work, like when you are, I guess, fine-tuning or like training this model from scratch? Do you take some, I guess, pre-trained transformer, chop a few layers and try to like train or like get some sort of embeddings? And
Yeah, so the approach we use is probably quite simple in terms of those who are really experienced with machine learning models, because there's some fancy ones like self-supervised transformers out there. There's one called Audio MAE, and how that works is you give it ideally hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of samples of audio or hours of audio perhaps, and it learns by masking large amounts of the audio clip, and then the model has to learn to reproduce the missing parts of the audio clip. This was something that the Perch team tried previously, but they found this didn't do as well as what we would call really an old school classifier now. So just training a efficient net B1, which is not a particularly large neural network. It's a convolutional neural network. So these are taken from the image domain, but because we work with spectrograms in the audio domain, you can actually use the same technology. And this classifier is just trained to identify in their case, the 10,000 different bird species. And you might have 5,000 examples for some species and only 5 for others. But it looks like then within the weights of this model, it's capturing loads of features that are super relevant to acoustics. And this did a way better job than some of the perhaps more current or modern machine learning techniques like self-supervised learning and transformers. And because it's quite a small model, it means it inferences quicker. There's less parameters than some of those as well.
And like spectrograms, do you use like MEL spectrograms or?
We use the MEL spectrogram, so that's where it's meant to represent how we hear. So the lower pitch sounds it's on a logarithmic scale, right? And so they're at the bottom of the scale and they get a larger portion to the frequency band they occupy. And that works really well for coral reefs actually, because a lot of the sounds are generally within the range of human voice, but we do record at a higher frequency as well. And then something we use is actually the PSEN spectrogram. And so it's a really neat way, it's something you can apply on top of the MEL spectrogram that pulls out the kind of the individual shapes within that spectrogram. I'm not going to explain this well because my knowledge on it is rusty, but if you look at these, the sounds pop out far more. It almost like it adds a shadow to behind those sounds that really stand out. And so it's good for picking out noises that occur in a recording where there's lots of background sound.
Oh, wow. And how long does it usually take to train the model, and like how many GPUs do you need to create one, or do you train on TPUs?
To develop our models, once we're throwing all the data in, all the birds, the YouTube audio, the Reef audio, it would take around 20 hours to train a model on a TPU pod. But we were running loads and loads of training runs. So it was Google, right? We could access loads of compute, which was a real enabler of this project. So we could brute force our way through all those different hyperparameters. So things like the efficient neck architecture, the learning rate, the batch size, parameters like that. We could try all the combinations all at once. So we'd train a whole load of these in one go. What was also another really important parameter was the ratio of those data sets. So I think we found in the end, we had the bird data was about half of our data that the model was seeing. About 0.4, so 40% of the data was from the YouTube domain, and only 0.1 was of our Reef audio. We could try all of those different ratios. We could try training on each of those domains separately, in combination. And so I think in total, we probably ran about 140 successful experiments. There were a whole load of ones that, you know how it is, the job doesn't work, it fails, or the result didn't make it into the paper. Which is something as a normal conservationist in machine learning would be probably impossible to access. On the scale of language model training going on now, this is nothing. This is child's play, but it's something that outside of a lab at Google still is probably not possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. And like you mentioned that like you use MEL spectrogram, so it's basically using computer vision models on the audio. So it's like roughly kind of almost the same model. You just like transform acoustics into vision and then like try to train almost like computer vision model. And do you work with computer vision models as well? Like I've heard you do like kind of photogrammetries or like...
Yeah, absolutely right. It's transferring so many of these technologies being developed for traditional computer vision works really well in audio. And something I'd love to find more time to do is play with traditional imagery as well. One project I had the chance to do that on was when I was working for Mars. I spent 6 months with them last year. We ran a hackathon. So they got 81 of their data scientists competing to train a model that could tell the difference between healthy and degraded coral reef images. So just kind of bird's eye view shots that we were getting for another project. One of my roles was to try and boost links with a business more broadly to the restoration project. And I did this through what I knew, which was data science and the people working there. And so they developed this model and then applied it to, or many teams I should say, and then we took the winning model and we applied it to images from restored reefs that over 80% of those were then classified as healthy. So that was really cool to see what we could do without even doing any labeling. So there's some awesome tools out there like Reef Cloud or CoralNet, where you do a small amount of annotation on each image. You do that for a bunch of these and then a model's fine-tuned and it learns on top of that. But we were doing this with no annotation. So it's a bit more of a black box. We don't know what the model was finding, but also a super quick way to see if we can actually just learn features that differentiate a healthy and a degraded coral reef. So that's a project I would love to expand. And there's lots of other similar ones. But fish identification, I think, is big on coral reefs. But for me, it's one good acoustic project after another keeps coming up for now. So I think I'll finish off my PhD continuing to work on those.
Wow, that's super interesting. Do you do monitoring with acoustic data and then taking pictures or videos underwater? What else are you usually trying to do? How do you protect the corals?
Yeah, so the monitoring data, if we're working on an acoustics project, will normally always need the kind of ground truth data as well, because it is a technology or an approach that's in its early days, in its infancy. So normally you get all the acoustic data and then you go and do some coral surveys or fish surveys or something as well to then show that these habitats are different. Look, normally to your peer reviewers when you're submitting a scientific paper, and then you say, and our acoustic data correlates really strongly with this, or we can tell these habitats apart by their acoustics, and here's the ground truth ecological data. I hope very soon we'll move to the point where people can just use the acoustic data if it's right for their project. So, for example, in reef restoration, there's always loads of work. Well, I say loads, actually not enough, but the first thing people will look at in the restoration project is the coral. So they'll see what's the percentage coral cover on the bottom of a reef is a really common one, or how much has survived, how much has it grown. Those are kind of easy measures to get. If you want the broader ecological community, that's really hard. And so having an expert in the water who can identify all those fish species and count them is a very rare skill to find and very logistically complicated. But with acoustics, we might be able to actually fill some of that gap by getting this data and automating the analysis. So that's where I see it filling a niche. There's still the gold standard of having expert marine biologists in the water counting everything, but we can't do that on the scales that we need.
Yeah, and it seems one kind of modality like acoustics could be limited because not maybe every fish makes sounds, or video could be limited because you can't really see at night, or maybe if the water is murky. Is it possible maybe to kind of I guess it's wise when you combine all of them and to have a kind of holistic view. Do you think it would be possible in the future to combine them somehow with AI and maybe train multimodal model for it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally right. And it depends what your project needs. There's all these different domains of data you can get. And the future has got to be either boat towed surveys or actually underwater autonomous drones. There's some work developing those that can get the image data, they can get the acoustic data and other things, maybe about the organics in the water, chemical signatures. So models that combine all of those, I think, will be key. But we actually know so little about the relationship with all of those and the ecology we care about, or how that changes in the world. So it's going to take a kind of iterative process of developing those, but alongside improving our understanding of how these translate to different reefs in the world and what's good and what's bad to get to that point as well, I think.
And what are the metrics we usually look? For example, I've heard rugosity or something, like shape of the reef somehow correlates with the health.
Yeah, rugosity, that 3D complexity is definitely an important one, because that's key to providing coastal protection, often from storm surges. So there's a really sort of tangible link between a health metric and a service it provides. Of course, there's just a raw diversity. So what's the count of species present on the reef in terms of corals and fish and other invertebrates? That can change where you are in the world. So say if you're at the center of the Coral Triangle, a beautiful place called Raja Ampat in Indonesia, I believe there's 550 species of coral found in this tiny area. If you go into the whole of the Caribbean, there's only about 50 coral species present there. And it's not to say those reefs are perhaps less healthy than they might be elsewhere, but you've got to have different goalposts. And so that diversity, I think, is key. And then standing stock biomass of reef fish is often a really popular one, because they do provide that nutrition source. So sustainably done, that can be a great thing, and it's a great resource for communities there who rely on the protein and the minerals that's actually in a a lot of these fish. It's a really key source for them. So those are just a few of the common health measures. There's loads of others out there.
We spoke about one trip for you, like to Indonesia. Like, do you go? Like, what other research expeditions you like the most?
I've maybe spent about a year of my life on fieldwork for research, and half of that has been in Indonesia, probably at this site where we work around Hope Reef with Mars. And that's probably my favorite spot because I've been there so many times. I think the project's so inspiring. I spent a couple of months as well in a place called Lizard Island on the Great Barrier Reef, which was such a unique spot because it's one of those islands that's many kilometers off from the mainland. It's a national park, so there's very few people ever get to go there. I was really lucky. And there's a research base that's run out there. So there's often, anything between, I think, about 10 and 40 researchers working there at a time, out on the reef every day. And it was just such a magical, remote spot. It was incredible to be working there. Another place I spent some time was an island called Moorea in French Polynesia for 3 months. I would say it's probably the most stunning place I've seen in terms of the landscape of the island. It was absolutely beautiful. I think I put some pictures up on my social media and my friends were saying, these aren't real, like you photoshopped them. And no, this was just from my, I think like iPhone 5 at the time. The reefs there, they're a mixed bag. So it's one of the islands where I was, the population's growing and the reefs aren't in the best state around most of the island. I know other places in French Polynesia I didn't have a privilege to visit, but other spots in French Polynesia, they are stunning and they're really beautiful as well. So those are some of the places I've been on field work. I did my dive master in Thailand. I've done a little bit of field work off the south coast of the UK. So yeah, being really lucky to go to some amazing places.
How do you compare Thailand with UK?
Yeah, they're very different. I was on you may have heard of Koh Tao if you're a diver. It's one of the most popular dive spots in the world, mainly because it's cheap. And I think there's about 80 dive schools present on this island. So it's not one you go for the world's most pristine reefs. But it was a great place for me to learn. The dive school I was at, Syrie Cottage, shout out to them, would recommend. The UK actually exceeded my expectations. Obviously, water's way colder. We're in dry suits. You think the diversity wouldn't be as stunning, but we were actually on a lot of seagrass and kelp habitat. I was helping a researcher studying wrasse in the area, looking at the impact of fisheries on them. And we were out there in the summer. We got some really awesome spots. The water clarity was great. These were genuinely like really stunning habitats to be on and be able to see that far and all the life that was there. So yeah, I think it depends on the time of year and you've got to get lucky with the weather, but there's some beautiful diving around there in the UK as well.
In your journey of marine conservation, what was your biggest challenge that you had to overcome and how did you overcome it?
I think for me, the biggest one, especially in my early days, and it often is the case, is finding that way to carve out your niche, to find those research gaps where there's important work to be done, but they're not finding. You go on Google Scholar and people have been publishing in that area for like 20 years. That happens all the time. And so that can be really hard. So you need a great lab group to help with that. That's what I had. I was able to join these researchers studying reef acoustics and learn from them, and then start to think about, okay, here's some cool things I could maybe start trying. So that was probably one of the hardest obstacles I had to overcome throughout my entire research career to date. But yeah, I think once you get past that and you've found a couple of those areas and then you've done a couple of projects, suddenly 4 more present themselves. And then you do those and it's just exponential. Now there's so many projects I've just had to shelve. I've not even been able to take on, and cool work that I think could be done that you end up picking and choosing. But it's nice to have gone from the early days to being in that place where I am now.
What are your next projects for you upcoming?
In the immediate future, on my PhD, continuing with the acoustics work. So we've got this data from sites that Mars have helped restore around the world. And that's to see, do we universally see recovery of the soundscape on restored reefs compared to healthy and degraded controls? I'm starting work on that in just a couple of weeks, maybe even sooner. Now we have the data. There's another project I spent a lot of time working on, which is detecting bomb fishing. So we've been sending recorders around the world to sites where bomb fishing goes on. and it's to try and build a model that will generalize to detect this in new areas, is robust to the variety of different sounds we might hear as just background noise, and hopefully produce something that will be a model, open source software that NGOs, conservationists, or marine authorities might be able to access using the $150 Hydromoth we helped develop. And using this model, they can start telling if bomb fishing is happening in their area, how much. That's another project I've got lined up later on in my PhD.
Would it be possible to have a real-time kind of detection of where bomb happening?
It's definitely possible. So there's an amazing group called Stop Fish Bombing who do this already. I collaborate with them, so they've got data for me, and we've been comparing so many notes on what we're doing. And they've set this up in Malaysia, where they used a technology called Shot Spotter that was actually developed for gunshot detection by law enforcement in cities, but they found it wasn't too hard to almost copy and paste their algorithm into the underwater domain, where they've got networked hydrophones, and then can run live detection and real-time location. And so they've had a huge amount of success. I think the system was running for a few months in Malaysia, just seeing how it's going, seeing how much bomb fishing was happening. Then the authorities used this. They apprehended 5 bomb fishermen, and the next month it went down 80%. So that's a really awesome approach. It's not easy to implement, and in terms of the conservation budget that a lot of these marine authorities or NGOs might have, it's hard to put in place, but we're looking to try and move towards even cheaper ways of doing this, using things like Hydromoths and stuff like Raspberry Pis to network these devices and stuff like that. I think it would be really cool to see that happen in the next few years.
And how much one hydrophone usually costs?
Before we were working with these $3,000 hydrophones, they were pretty much the cheapest one you could get. They're really good, probably massively over-spec'd for what we needed. So the cheapest one that's widely available is the Hydromoth. For once you've bought the SD card and the batteries and the case, it's about $150 all in. And that thing will record for over 2 weeks on the frequencies that we care about on Coral Reef if you give it the best batteries.
And how many of them do you need to detect like bomb fishing in like one spot roughly? Or like to cover maybe like a few kilometers, or like a specific area where it's happening, maybe this island?
Bomb fishing acoustics is a really interesting medium to study it through, because sound travels 4.3 times faster underwater. So if you've ever been diving, you might have noticed your dive buddy's computer beeps, and you don't know, is it your buddy's, is it yours? Because sound's coming at you from all directions. So we're not used to perceiving that. But because sound travels so far, especially a loud sound like a bomb travels really far. So I've seen some work that has estimated we can hear them up to 50 kilometers away. Wow. So we've got one recorder we've had deployed somewhere in the world. This single recorder heard 4,500 bombs over 6 months in the area.
4,500?
Yeah, so it's really shocking numbers, and it's definitely a hotspot for where this goes on in the world, but there's loads of other places like that. So I'm hoping this technology will help people see how much it's actually going on.
Yeah, when you're looking at the coral reef, when you're studying it, like how many do you need hydrophones around this, or you usually go with one and like measure everywhere?
It depends on your project. So previously we had to do that, right? We maybe had like 2 or 3 of these really expensive sound trap hydrophones, and we'd be having to rotate them between all the different sites because all the recorders are slightly different, and we just didn't have enough to get spatial replication. Now, when we go out, we put 18 recorders down, for example, where I work in Indonesia. We've got 6 healthy, 6 degraded, 6 restored sites. We put 1 on each. We could even put more on each to get a higher replication with insight. And so there's definitely a lot of work to figure out, what's the optimal amount to have, what's the least amount you can put out to get data that's still of the value that you need. So it depends on what you're trying to measure, absolutely. If you're looking for really subtle differences, you're probably going to need more recorders on these different spots, because there's definitely a really local soundscape, almost a micro soundscape in these habitats as well. But when we're looking at night and day between healthy and bombfish sites, generally it doesn't matter where we put it, we're going to notice it over the course of time that we're recording.
Can you speak more about this digital twins for Coral Reef project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we've both been talking about this and brainstorming this space, haven't we? And this is something I think is going to be a huge part of the future of monitoring coral reefs, because it's super easy relative to the other data we get to go out and just take loads of pictures of a reef, right? And actually do this perhaps in a standardized way. So swimming in lanes with a couple of GoPros set up in a stereo format. This is something we've done to collect about 10,000 images from a square kilometre of reef. So 20 by 50 metres of reef. We've done this in all our 18 sites. We've worked with consultants to produce these giant 3D models. They're actually too large and clunky to work with. So we cut these down into 5x5 areas, and it uses a technology called photogrammetry that stitches these photos together, and it can make that digital twin. So that 3D model that you can look at, you can rotate, you can put onto a VR headset and see what's on every inch of that reef. And so I think being able to scale that, have technology and pipelines where we can do that on a square kilometre or more. You could have a boat circle an entire island, go onto another one, maybe do a few in the course of a day, and we can get a snapshot of these habitats in a way we've just not been possible before. We put expert divers on. They probably measure a tiny fraction of the reef by putting transects down and quadrats and counting the corals and things, but we could get a snapshot of these almost like Google Maps, the street view, that aspect of Google Maps. Having that for coral reefs, I think, would be the path forward in monitoring these. And then we can see, how does that change over time? How does it respond if this hotel gets built just down the coastline, or if someone's implemented restoration? So there's so many possibilities. I think imagination's almost a limitation with what you could do with this data.
Yeah, imagine if you could also scroll back in time and see how it was changing over time, so that...
Yeah, we see it with satellite imagery, right? People do that on Google Maps and using similar tools. They see reforestation happening or deforestation, like you see that often.
If you had unlimited resources, I don't know, maybe like a few $1 billion or like $1 trillion, what would you do?
I think digital twinning would be a technology I'd love to pursue. So get that street view of coral reefs, get it with underwater drones that are autonomous. They're going out there and collecting this data for us all the time. And that other data we mentioned earlier, it might be the acoustics, other properties in the water, taking video of the fish communities. And so we could have this almost perfect digital twin of the world's reefs. They're 0.1% of the ocean floor. Perhaps it's not inconceivable in a few decades' time we could have mapped all of the world's coral reefs using this. And then using that to document what state are all the reefs in the world like, and relating that to biodiversity credits and protecting these. And when you've got this tangible asset that people could log onto a platform and see the reef and see what it was like 10 years ago and see, oh, well, it looks like some damage is happening, or what it was like 20 years ago. We'll see the impacts of things like storms or sedimentation from construction. I think that'll be so powerful just from the communication and engagement perspective as well, of course, with all the scientific benefits. But I think monitoring is one aspect to saving biodiversity, through that engagement being really key. But then I think there's so much more work to be done in requiring governments, industry to have to, I say minimize, but stop their impact, or any impact they have to be able to counterbalance. And I think we have so many solutions for that actually just aren't being implemented. I don't know if that's something you can throw any amount of money at to make happen, but perhaps there's a lot more work to be done in that space to make it easier and more efficient for people to be able to do that. So that's probably a big key part of the puzzle as well.
Yeah. What do you think are the biggest challenges which holding us back?
Absolutely, it's the kind of short-term mentality that our society, or at least our culture, works in. You hear governments working on election cycles, businesses focused on having to maximize profits through other pressures, even if those members of the boards might want to do the most sustainable thing. They know they're not going to keep their position if they do that. And so we need those broader societal influences and pressures to be the case. And so that's probably going to come from government recognizing the long-term importance of that, and then regulating industry, but increasingly industry taking on that in itself as well. These probably dynasties in companies like Google or Microsoft, or Aramco, like the Saudi Arabian oil company, they might be around for decades or centuries. If they want to stay around, they need a planet to live on and operate. So perhaps they'll take some of that responsibility as well.
You mentioned you also worked on dolphins in Australia with recordings?
That was a brief project for me. I was lucky to be doing a year of my undergraduate at the University of Queensland in Australia. And at the end of this, I was just looking around to find any way to kind of volunteer my time in the last month, because I was doing my studies and I had this bit of time. I wanted to get the work experience. And so I joined a group out there, and I worked closely with two researchers, Barry McGovern and Katja Ovsyannikova, who were both PhD students studying dolphin communication. So there was a lot of boring work in the job where I was doing those things we're trying to automate away now, right? I was just annotating loads of recordings to find signature whistles of each dolphin, because they were studying the behavioral and communication between these. I also got to go out to where they get some of the data, a place called Moreton Island, where it's a really unique spot because there's a wild dolphin pod come and interact with humans to be fed with a hotel. For better or for worse, I know there's implications of that kind of scenario, but it provided a really unique experimental setup. So got the chance to go and collect some data with them there as well.
What did you learn, the most interesting things about dolphins? Did they tell you anything?
I think for me, I've probably forgotten half the knowledge that I had from them, but it was learning things like that signature whistle and being the person there listening to these dolphins essentially speak to each other. So each dolphin has its own whistle that's its name, its identifier, and other dolphins have identifiers for those as well that they use to refer to each other. So for me, that was a really cool dolphin fact, and it was great to be eavesdropping in and listening to it, and we can use that to tell who the dolphins were.
People also listening to audio for the coral reefs as well sometimes, or at least in the past before we had those really good models that you're working on.
For the same reasons we've discussed in terms of soundscape monitoring, I also worked on a project with a PhD student. She's just finished actually, Isla Davidson, who's at Bristol, who's studying the Ambon damselfish. That's a lot of the work I was doing about 2 months I had on Lizard Island. She was studying their behavior and how does their behavior change in response to predators being present or competitors. And so they vocalize, and they're vocalizing for the same reasons that animals do on land. So to attract mates or to warn of presence of predators or try and scare them off. And so we listen to many of the recordings to identify that as well.
Wow, so coral reefs could kind of scream of fear or to...
Yeah, exactly that. The individual species, so this Ambon damselfish was responding in this way, and so many other fish species are going to do it for the same reasons. It might sound completely different. They might respond in different ways, but of course there's a reason they're making this noise, right? So there's so much to be learnt about it there.
And the corals, they're more like animals rather than plants, right?
The corals themselves, they're like a hybrid. So they are animals at their core, but they really rely on their symbiont called zooxanthellae. So they're a symbiotic algae that lives within coral, and they're photosynthetic. So corals have two modes of feeding typically. They filter out detritus in the water, so small bits of organic matter that are floating through, and they've got these tentacles that come out and they're grabbing all this detritus. But at the same time, they have the photosynthetic algae, and this is what gives them their beautiful colors, that are capturing sunlight coming through the water and then performing photosynthesis to stitch together organic molecules and produce matter that the coral itself can work. So it's a really fascinating symbiotic relationship.
How does the data flow looks like when you record the data, let's say with the hydrophones, and then what are the other steps, what's happening with this data, and then who does what decisions in general? So how does the process look like?
Yeah, so that process is something that firstly, it's something that could be built on, optimized, improved. We've been mainly individual researchers working on this, but at the moment, this is you've just pulled the hydrophone out of the water, right? So let's say you're there, you take it back to wherever you're staying, and often we might leave them recording or just stop them overnight or something, and they're back in the water the next day potentially. But it will come to the point where we plug it into our laptop, download it all onto a hard drive, and from there, it really depends on what analysis you want to do. So for me, prepping that data for machine learning is always going to involve removing the periods that's not under the water. We don't need those. And then thinking about the processing we're going to use. So some of my earliest work used what we would call handcrafted features in terms of machine learning terminology, where we'd extract calculated values from these, which could be simple, like how loud is the recording, or something more complex, like what's the variability between different frequency bands. So my early work focused on extracting a suite of these, potentially doing it in different frequency bands and training models on those. Now more so, and you also have to produce your spectrogram to build those on top of as well. A lot of the time I should add, which all have their own parameters you can tweak as well in all these settings. Now we prefer to extract features using deep learning models that have learned these features rather than something handcrafted by a soundscape ecologist or acoustic mathematician. Deep learning models learn these for ourselves. So we've used those networks that were developed on YouTube data. Now we've got SurfPerch, which gives us the best set of any model out there for extracting features. And then these can be used to train other models to build detectors, classifiers for individual sounds, or unsupervised learning to just explore our data and see, well, what periods of recording or which sites seem to cluster close together and sound similar, which are different, how does that change over time? So that's the pipeline from we've got the data to kind of getting through to the early phases of analysis.
And do you use any other sensing solutions like environmental DNA, or you mainly use like acoustics, images or videos, and maybe drones?
At the moment, I have pretty much only worked on the acoustic side of things, and I think it's really exciting to start combining these, going multimodal, comparing acoustic data with image data or video data. I've not worked on the eDNA myself. I really flirted with the idea of a project on this on our Reef system. Where we work at the time and the way eDNA operates at the moment is you're taking water samples from the water column, and the sites are just a bit too close together that we get too much of a spillover effect. But there could be some really cool stuff to, look at the eDNA in terms of a substrate in the benthic material. And I've seen RNA is actually another one. So RNA is what's produced by, it's when a ribosome reads your DNA in a cell, it produces an RNA strand, which is transported to transported to the ribosome, which then produces the protein from that. RNA has quite a short half-life, so that's something that could work over these smaller scales as well. But it's super new flashy technology, so I don't think it'll be the first thing we try. It'll probably get established elsewhere. But yeah, there's some scope to work on that too.
Interesting. And you were mentioning someone else's or other project about artificial light pollution. Can you speak about this one?
That was partly why we were on the expedition in French Polynesia, where we were for 3 months. There's a French research base called Creob, and we joined Suzanne Mills and Ricardo Beldade, who were leading a lab group out there. And
maybe they should create a rap group as well.
Yeah, we were helping on their artificial light pollution project. They were looking at how is this impacting primarily anemone fish as a study organism, with controls where they were being impacted by light pollution and then controls where this wasn't the case. So we helped with this experiment. I was primarily there working to develop the Hydrophone, testing this out. I should say, for Open Acoustics had given us some of the first prototypes. And also with Ricardo and other colleagues, we collected data from mesophotic coral reefs and shallow coral reefs to see if we find a difference between the soundscape of these habitats. So mesophotic reefs are where the light's really starting to attenuate. They're about 50, 60 meters deep.
I think also having a strong community who would help the oceans is very important. And you are part of multiple, for example, it seems you are organizing a Reef Conservation UK. How does this work?
The conference, Reef Conservation UK, I'd absolutely recommend to anyone if you're a scientist or something closely related to it, or just interested in coral reef science based in London or nearby. It's happening this year in December. Next year, we'll probably move to another institute in the UK, then back to London every other year. And generally, we get together about 150, primarily scientists, some in industry as well, studying coral reefs in the UK. And you can learn all about the research. There's a whole load of presentations and just a chance to network and mingle with people as well who are doing this. So for those in their early career, it's always a great conference as well. I find now as well, I'm only a PhD student, but I get those undergrads and masters now coming up to me saying, oh, I'm really interested in the work you do. Can I learn more about it? And I was doing the same 3 years ago as well. Like I was there for the first time asking people about that. So that's a brilliant community. It's a good way to kind of just get a heartbeat of what's going on in the science as well at the moment and see what's happening and stay up to date.
What advice would you give for young people who would like to start their career in conservation or AI plus conservation?
If they want to do that in both, I'd already say that's ticking off this piece of advice, because for me, I found what brought so many benefits was going interdisciplinary. So if you love conservation and you're really interested in AI, there's such a demand for that at the moment. And for those, often I talk to those who just work in AI or just work on conservation. But I think adding that new aspect, another field that others aren't necessarily going to have experience in with that overlap, is really key. And that's what has brought about so many of the opportunities I've been able to have, is developing this twin skill set. And it could be a combination of anything, right? It could be conservation and you're really into that genetic or eDNA component, something that's a bit outside the box. Or maybe you work in AI and you actually know a lot about ocean data sets or something out there that might be useful to develop new AI models. It's not just like the 10,000th paper on ImageNet this year. So that would be my advice, like go interdisciplinary and look for those areas of overlap and force your way in there and expand them.
How would your dream future look like?
And this is on a personal level or just for, what our planet should look like?
Both personal level and planetary level.
Well, starting on the planetary level, going back to the start of our conversation, I want to see us live fully sustainably on the planet that we're in, and that there's almost the impact we're having in is going to become less and less measurable. So we can have thriving wild ecosystems as if we're not here. And yeah, there might be significant parts of the planet that are kind of cordoned off, and that's where us as the humans are. But there's so much we could essentially leave untouched. That would be my dream, to see of how we live and thrive on this planet. Personally, I want to keep working in the space where I am now. I'm really enjoying the skill set I've developed in my graduate studies in machine learning and AI, and I want to keep building that and using this technology to help with conservation and environmental problems, especially in the ocean. So a big leap for me is probably finishing my PhD in a year or a bit more, and looking for a route to hopefully continue doing that.
What question would you ask the next guest on the podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. So assuming, I guess they're an ocean techie person.
It could be maybe someone else.
Okay, yeah, well.
Or ocean techie, yeah.
If they're an ocean techie person, I would love to know, just almost like a scattergun of, in a few sentences, what are some of the cool technologies they've seen out recently that someone else like me who tries to keep an ear to the ground on this stuff but might not have heard of, because there's so much going on, right? It's easy to miss these things. So what do they think's cool and new at the moment? And they don't need to know it inside out, but maybe just a dozen things that they've seen happen recently.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sergey. It's been brilliant to share everything. And yeah, delighted to talk about the work we've been doing.
If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. And also let me know how to improve the podcast by leaving a comment down below. Bye.